Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. This Sunday is Palm Sunday. Quiet in a lot of churches where it's usually not quiet. Is this coronavirus outbreak a black swan event? Now, for some of you, some of us in fact, might not be terribly familiar with this term. I don't know if Nassim Taleb invented it or if he popularized it with his 2007 book, Black Swan. Basically, a black swan event is this. A black swan is an unprecedented event that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. Black swan events are characterized by their extreme rarity, their severe impact, and the widespread insistence that they were obvious in hindsight. A black swan is an extremely rare event with severe consequences. Anyway, you can read the things on the slide. So Taleb, a lot of people say, oh, the pandemic is a black swan event. It's a black swan event. And Taleb, kind of in a prickly way, comes out and says, no, it's not a black swan event. It's a white swan event. And I just learned what a black swan was. So apparently we have a black swan, a gray swan, and a white swan. And so I found a little helpful diagram on the internet. And the black swan event has three principal characteristics: unpredictable, mass impact, after the fact, explained to appear less random and more predictable. A gray swan event is predictable. Impact can easily cascade. After the fact, shifts focus to errors of judgment and some other human form of causation. A white swan event is a certainty. And this is part of what Taleb mentions. And just as this tweet, here in Brazil we don't have tests, but ready pits we have, makes the point that when I see this, I think this is, for the most part, how human beings have endured pandemics throughout history. What if we were to stop this shutdown or lockdown or shelter-in-place order? The virus would run through our society. The healthcare system would be overwhelmed. Many people would die, but within a couple of months or so, perhaps life would get back to normal. Or maybe not. Or maybe there would never be a normal. Pandemics are a constant throughout human history. Just this week I had a very interesting conversation with a Christian man from Toronto. He goes to a Roman Catholic church that has a Syriac and Arabic liturgy. And he was talking about religion as risk management, brought in Taleb, and I brought in Chesterton, and we talked about a bunch of the other things. And he pointed me to the fact that there's a passage in Isaiah that's getting a lot of attention now. It goes like this: "Go, my people, enter your rooms, and shut the doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until his wrath has passed away. See, the Lord is coming out of his dwelling to punish the people of the earth for their sins. The earth will disclose the blood shed on it. The earth will conceal its slain no longer." And right from that little verse, you can see why suddenly it popped up into everyone's attention. Because now we have billions of people sheltering in place, and if you look at my last few sermons, this question ringing in our ears is, Did God cause this? Is this because we've been bad to nature? And do we, people who are not Christian, or it's simply human nature to look at this and say, well, this is a response to something bad that we've done. And this gets into the question, of course, is, where is God in the pandemic? And, well, what you see is that these kinds of questions go back a long, long ways. And in fact, religious communities still, in some ways, act out of different playbooks than other communities. Now, in Sacramento, there's been quite a bit of conversation about this because the Sacramento County has noted that about a third of the coronavirus cases are connected to churches. And in fact, this one church, somebody in our church did a little bit of math and said 20% of Sacramento's cases come out of this one church. Now, someone on Twitter, when I posted this, someone on Twitter wrote back and said, this is an exaggeration. Our church actually closed, yada, yada, yada. And I think there's also another dynamic in here that as is in the case of the church just down the road from us that had a cluster of outbreaks. I spoke to someone who goes to that church, and that person said, well, this group of people, they were a group of friends. And so whereas public health might look at the church, those friendship communities endure even without the institutional aspect. This has also reached the attention of New York City, because the Hasidic community has also been sort of singled out as a community that's been quite close. And so the virus has, whether people are meeting in official religious worship services that are or are not called off, or people are meeting with their friends in the home, one way or another, these communities have a high degree of contact, and so they persist. But it's also been clear that in the context of this virus, whether it's in Jewish communities in New York, certain church communities in Sacramento, Islamic communities in the Islamic world, there's an aspect within religion that endures, a pattern that endures, that, well, when the government says no, we say no to the government. Okay, there's sort of a reactivity that comes into the culture of religious communities as well. And even before counties started shutting down churches, that reaction was very common on Twitter. And what we see in that human beings are, we're told by the brain science people, that we're amazing at pattern recognition, and that's a really good thing. We get our mental pictures of the world, of how the world works, from the patterns we see. And in fact, what's happening today with the virus is a huge experiment on our capacity to manage a threat we cannot see. And the way we do that is we manage that threat by looking for patterns in things we can see. Are they wearing a mask? Do they look clean? Are they from a particular ethnic group? Are they on a subway car together? Do they share a home together? We look at all the visible patterns in order to try to deal with the unseen thing that we can't deal with. And so we're really good at working on patterns. Patterns of human behavior become rituals which signal to each other what to expect, and religious communities maintain those rituals. Some of those rituals are overt, and some of those rituals only manifest when certain things happen in the community that elicit those responses. And we all like our neighbors to be predictable. It's better the devil you know than the devil you don't know, as the old saying goes. We anticipate the future based on these patterns and rituals. And so they're very important to us. But here's the problem. Patterns run in far longer cycles than our individual memories. For example, if you Google the Great Flood of 1862, you'll find that floodwaters were 200 or 300 miles wide and 320 miles long and 20 miles wide in the Central Valley from that inundation. And here's a little etching, a sketch of all the boats going down the streets of Sacramento. The whole Central Valley filled up with water in 1862. Now, we're always sensitive to floods here in Sacramento and the Central Valley, but that was a big one. Now, you talk to flood people and they'll say things like 100-year flood or a 500-year flood. They're looking at patterns and trying to language how often these things come around. But because they're not within our individual experience, we don't think about them. The last big pandemic, there were some smaller ones, but the last big pandemic was 1918. That's sometimes called the Spanish flu. Now, the oldest member of our church just died in early 1919, didn't quite reach the age of 100, but he was born in 1919, and that shows, well, both just how far, but also how recent that pandemic was, and for the most part, because very, very few people have a memory of it in their minds, we adjust all of our patterns with that kind of thing outside, which is why Taleb says, well, this pandemic was eminently predictable, and so our inability to respond to it well is really sort of on us. Now, why do I bring all this stuff up on Palm Sunday? Because Palm Sunday, well, we know what Palm Sunday is. Palm Sunday is the day when Jesus the King comes to his city, Jerusalem. He is received by the people. He rides the royal mount of the Hebrew kings. Hebrew kings did not ride huge war horses. They rode donkeys. Just read the book of Samuel and you'll figure that out. And there's also this miracle which isn't often noticed in the story, where Jesus rides in not only as Israel's king, but nature's king. He rides an unbroken animal into the city, demonstrating his lordship over the natural world. And when some of the religious authorities ask some of his disciples to keep it down and don't celebrate the way they are, the response is, well, even the stones would cry out, which is basically making the same point. There's your Palm Sunday message right there, but I'm not done. See, what we do is we project these events into our world, and we've seen a lot of this now with the reemergence of a pandemic, something that is beyond our cycles to remember. Here's a nice Palm Sunday piece of art by Pietro Lorenzetti. Nobody that I knew, but you can find him on Wikipedia, from 1320. But notice, here's Jesus coming into what appears to be an Italian Renaissance town, and everybody is sort of dressed as Italian Renaissance people, and you'll find this commonly through Renaissance art and through art of many ages. It's a projection of the biblical event into our world, and now, this is pretty much the only way that we can assimilate information of this kind and adjust our lives accordingly, but it's helpful to be aware of what we're doing. And part of what I try to do, and pastors and theologians and biblical scholars try to do, is, as best we can, project back into the minds of the people there. And so the question is, what was on the minds of the people in Jerusalem when Jesus went riding into town? In many ways, Judas Maccabeus was on the minds of people in Jerusalem. And some of you might say, well, who is Judas Maccabeus? Well, those of you who know the difference between Protestant Bibles and so-called Catholic Bibles know that the Catholic Bibles sometimes have all these extra books in them. Well, what are in those extra books? Well, one of those extra books is 1st Maccabees, and 1st Maccabees has the story of Judas Maccabeus, after he had won some victories, his march to Jerusalem to retake God's city and to purify God's temple. And if you want to understand what Jesus does on Palm Sunday and what it means, it's really important to understand something about the story of Judas Maccabeus. And again, you can find that in your fatter Bible that has the book of 1st Maccabees. You can find it on the internet. It's all been in public domain for a very long time. And in fact, the entrance of Judas Maccabeus into Jerusalem wasn't that much further away than the 1918 pandemic is to us than it was from Jesus. A little bit further, but not that much. So when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, what's on the minds of the people? Well, let's take a look at this. Alexander the Great, you might have heard of him. He had this amazing conquest, and for that conquest earned the moniker Son of God. But after he died, people still aren't quite sure how he died and what he died of. Some people believe he was poisoned. His generals split up his empire. And part of what was common, again, in the ancient world, which would be common today if we think in more secular terms than religious terms, and if we understand the relationship between, let's say, politics and religion, the generals began to insist that all the people in their realm adopt Greek ways. And for them, this was just as much a matter of health and flourishing and being a good person as keeping a pandemic and keeping the stay-in-place orders would be for us today. The Greek ways were considered the best ways. That was how a flourishing society should live, and so other ways were suppressed. And now the book of 1st Maccabees tells the story from a Jewish perspective. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom, that all should be one people. And the world will be as one. You could have John Lennon sing that song. And all of them should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the commands of the king, because basically when a new regime came into place, that's what you did. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his, now the word gets translated religion, and it's a fair translation. They all gladly accepted these styles of worship, these styles of organizing one's life. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messenger to Jerusalem and to the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow the customs strange to the land. Now notice how these religious patterns are deep, and you're going to have conflict. You're going to have a religious conflict over something like this. He directed them to follow the customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice offerings and drink offerings in the sanctuary, and to profane Sabbaths and festivals. In other words, if you're going to train the people, you're going to have to train them to work on the Sabbath. All right? To defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. Now, if you read the New Testament and you read the story of the Gospels and you understand what happened back here during the Seleucid kings under the generals that inherited the kingdom from Alexander the Great, you should have an understanding for why the kinds of issues get debated with Jesus that are debated, and why so many highly religious people didn't think much of Jesus. Okay, this is important background, which is why, again, it's in the Catholic Bibles, and why, for example, the Protestant reformers like John Calvin and the Belgic Confession say, well, these books are profitable for reading. All right? They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. In other words, they're trying to reformat the culture. They're trying, in some ways, to bring in the kingdom of God by changing the culture of the people. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. So in other words, failing to adopt the new culture is a capital crime. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 140th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. In other words, they put up an image. They defiled the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple that had been built in the wake of the coming back to the land after the Babylonian captivity, then eventually came back under Cyrus the Great. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of these houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. And they kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of the burnt offering. In other words, they defiled the altar as well. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and get this, and their families, and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. They knew how to make a point. Now, how will this be received? Well, there's a family, the Maccabeus family, and zeal will consume them. When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer a sacrifice on the altar of Modin, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred, and he gave vent to righteous anger, and he ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas had done against Zimri, son of Salu. And you can read that story in the book of Numbers. And if you read N.T. Wright's biography of the Apostle Paul, you'll recognize that this is a critically important thing. And actually, when Jesus cleanses the temple, that gets pulled up. But again, and this is where we're going with this, there's a recalibration of zeal that happens in Jesus, if you haven't picked this up yet. When Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me," then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all they had in the town. Sort of like those young high school kids in Red Dawn when the Soviets and the Cubans invaded America. Great to get a Red Dawn citation in a sermon. Now, what does that have to do with Palm Sunday? Well, after he had consolidated some of his victories, Mattathias had died by now, and Judas Maccabeus is the one in charge of the rebellion. Then Judas gathered together all the Israelites in Gilead, the small and the great, with their wives and children and goods, a very large company, to go to the land of Judah. So they came to Ephron. This was a large and very strong town on the road, and they could not go around it to the right or to the left. They had to go through it. But the people of the town shut them out and blocked up the gates with stones. Judas sent them this friendly message: "Let us pass through your land to get to our land. No one will do you harm. We will simply, pass on foot." Now, this is also something from the Old Testament that is getting remembered here. But they refused to open up to him. Then Judas ordered proclamation to be made to the army that all should encamp where they were. So the men of the forces encamped, and he fought against the town all that day and all that night, and the town was delivered into his hands, and he destroyed every male by the edge of the sword. And again, that sounds horrible to us. Pretty common practice in the ancient world. And the town was delivered into their hands. What happened to the women and the children? Probably slaves and concubines. He destroyed every male by the edge of the sword and razed and plundered the town. And he passed through the town over the bodies of the dead. Then they crossed the Jordan into the large plain before Bethshan. Judas then rallied the laggards and encouraged the people. By that point, everybody's paying attention. And the people all the way until he came into the land of Judah, so that he went up to Mount Zion with joy and gladness and offered burnt offerings, because they had returned in safety, not one of them had fallen. This is the triumphal entry of Judas Maccabeus. Now, Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and he rides on a donkey. What is in everybody's mind? This is the template on the minds of the people. This is why all are interested in Jesus. What's he going to do? Would Jesus do to the Romans what Judas did to the Greeks and their collaborators and the insufficiently zealous and collaborative countrymen? What kind of Messiah will Jesus be? As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David!" This is the new David, right here, right now, and he will do to the Romans what David did to the Philistines. He will do to the Romans what Judas Maccabeus did to the Greeks. He will purify God's city and chasten God's people to once again get in line and get it straight. And those who don't join with him, well, you know what Judas Maccabeus did. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred. What's he gonna do? Who is this? The crowd answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Here he is. It's coming. It's really happening. Why did I talk about these swans at the beginning of this? Here's the question. Was Palm Sunday a white swan event? Was it certain? Was its impact easily estimated? After the fact, explanations shift the focus in judgment and some of those on a form of human causation. Well, the Sanhedrin's going to have a conversation about this. We saw that last week with the raising of Lazarus. Was Jesus a new Judas Maccabeus? Was this just normal pattern for imperial oppression and revolt? What about the religious pattern? Was this Jesus just acting in a religious way, resisting oppression and doing what the authorities say not to do? The Maccabees played from the script of Phinehas. Well, Jesus would show zeal in the temple, but like Judas? Now, the white swan script would have gone like this. The Romans actually were better than the Greeks at putting down revolts. The Romans were very good at it. They were quite adept at managing white swan events. Crucifixions, this is a picture of a crucifixion from the 20th century or from the 19th century. Crucifixions are actually pretty common throughout the world. They're very efficient political drama. Crucifixions are brutally effective political theater. Executions show political dominance, instill fear in the population, humiliate your enemies, control the masses through them. By Friday, Jesus comes in on Sunday. By Friday, people would say to Jesus, "You're no Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus knew how to do a triumphal entry. Judas Maccabeus knew how to run a revolt. Jesus, you're no Judas Maccabeus." Or was it a black swan event? Was it an unpredictable event, something that no one in town, including Jesus' own people, had any idea what he would do? Can a crucified man, someone who is, by all estimations, a loser in a revolt, can a crucified man become king of the world? Could a crucified man topple the Roman Empire? Imagine you've got to write a story in which for the first time somebody who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as being in some way part of the Creator God who's fashioned everything. And he's got to be convincing, not just to people now, but for 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. It's a really astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat, and that 4 people did it is amazing, notes Tom Holland. Yeah. The world was turned upside down. The world was changed. And everybody, in sort of a Scott Adams 2 movie type thing, everybody's watching one screen, and Jesus is watching the other. That week, he would gather for what his disciples thought was a Seder meal on one screen, and on the other, he said, "This is my body, broken for you. This is my body. This is my blood, shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And it's not just memory. We become his body as he feeds us his. We become his witness as he gives us his spirit. His black swan event becomes a new pattern that changes all the patterns of the world.